Well, it's a great pleasure for me to announce your talk now on the hinterlands of Singapore.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers. Good morning. So, it's been a super rich event so far, and what I'll try and do is speak a little bit more about the countryside and the role of the rural and its relationship to the process of urbanization that you've got a very good feeling for, I think, already after these 2.5 days. It's a discussion in 4 parts, as you can see. I'll begin by trying to unpack a little bit this slightly curious title, Spectacularization of the Urban and the Spectralization of the Rural. Then I want to kind of develop a kind of sensitivity in the room, I think, for the different kinds of rural. So we're not simply talking about the countryside, which is the left over from the city, and we know many different kinds of city and city qualities, but I want to talk about rural qualities as part of the urbanization story. And that has a very important theme relating to agriculture and to mechanization and to labor, which I will develop in the second section. Here I'll speak a little bit more about food production, especially in relationship to the sources of water, which are obviously primary for agricultural terrains. And here I'll kind of take a territorial look, if you like, into urbanization terrains through the watersheds of some of the world's most famous rivers. And again, the question of density that Lai Chu has already introduced reappears here in a slightly different guise. Then we'll go into a much more specific area. We'll look at Southeast Asia. We'll look at a particular kind of urbanization that's happening in Southeast Asia. And we can only understand that urbanization process if we have a feeling for the rural and the agricultural processes which are happening in the hinterlands. And then finally, because I'm an academic as well as an architect, I like to think in a kind of propositional mode. So I'll complete the discussion by speaking about a small and quite modest project that we hope will have big and significant effects precisely in these in situ urbanized territories that we see in Southeast Asia. So let's come back to this first question about the title. The image below, by the way, will recur a couple of times. If you're interested in this area, it's a very, very beautiful book, 1941. It was one of the first books to think about the rice economy of monsoon Asia, as it says. And just to tune your eyes, the monsoon Asia is described in the image below, but also the primary rice growing areas are also identified. And for those of you who know the geography of that area, you can already see Calcutta, Hong Kong, Saigon, as it was once called, are located precisely in these areas. So this is where I would like to go. As always, with a kind of slightly tricky title, it's useful to go to the dictionary. You'll see that both of these terms have a common root in the term scope, meaning to look. But the big difference is that the spectacle is something which is arranged to be displayed. So this is a kind of condition which is set up to be visualized, and in a simple kind of understanding, it's a kind of spectacle, it's a spectacular situation. And although it shares the same etymology, the spectre and the spectralization is really a kind of ghosting. So it's also an appearance, but it's an appearance which happens through a ghosting kind of condition. And I also want to keep that tension in mind, the fact that these are both shared, they have a shared etymology, but in a way one haunts the other. So one is a diminished visuality, but that diminished visuality, if you like, haunts and complicates, I hope, the spectacular conditions that we see in contemporary cities. So what I want to do is connect the spectacle to the urban and the spectre to the rural, and I want to make an argument that we are spectacularizing the urban at the expense of the rural, and that the really important condition for future urbanization involves a linking between these two conditions. So it's analytical and then becomes propositional later on. Now, it's actually not very hard to do, not very hard to demonstrate the spectacularization of the urban. In the last 10, 20 years, it's become one of the hot topics in the popular media. So one of the earliest magazine covers, Time magazine and Megacities from 1993, I think, Foreign policy from 2011, art galleries, so the Tate had a very big show in 2007, the National Geographic, one of the most significant kind of journals, did a huge special report on megacities. Now the important thing about this is kind of basically popular kind of media, quasi-academic popular media. In each case, they produce a special report on the city. So there's a sense of kind of crisis, there's a sense of impending kind of crisis, which is significant in the development and the spectacularization of the city. So journals, art galleries, art shows, biennale, again and again and again. That spectacularization has also occurred in academic work. So I'm sure you know the Endless City book and Living in the Endless City book. And they operate very much in a spectacular kind of mode, but they work through the graphic design and through number. And as you can see, the graphics are very heavily kind of dependent on key kind of statistics. 50% of the world's population is urbanized, for example. 75% by 2050 will be urbanized, and so on. When you dive into the book, you find that the whole of the kind of book, which is claiming a global account, we have to be aware of, is claiming a global account of urbanization, in fact hinges on a number of kind of key cities. So New York, Shanghai, London, Mexico City, Johannesburg, and Berlin. So there's a sense in which these cities are kind of brought up to stand for urbanization as a whole. It's a very beautiful book and a very sophisticated book, but it's also, I think, in my view, a rather dangerous and misleading book if we want to think about the wider consequences of urbanization. There's a related kind of literature which is also very interesting, Shadow Cities by Robert Neurath, Planet of the Slums by Mike Davis, which was a little bit earlier, and then more recently Doug Saunders' Arrival City. These books also deliver a very important component of the urbanization story, and they're delivering the kind of a story and account of the informal. And the informal city also doesn't escape the project of spectacularization. Again, you'll know most of these, I'm sure. So the City of God made Rocinha famous, Slumdog Millionaire made Dharavi famous, and The Constant Gardener made Kibera famous. And in the same way that Engelberg, in a way, is already spectacularized by its immersion in Bollywood culture, producing thereby a loop, a touristic loop, locating Engelberg inside a touristic economy. Precisely the same thing is going on in each of these cities. So we can do slum tours, and the slum tour population, the people who are traveling to see slums, are doing so on the back of either the academic work or then spiced up, if you like, by this popular kind of media. For those of you who know the British scene, there's a very important figure, a popular figure, Kevin MacLeod, who's a kind of DIY self-improvement kind of person, and he got on the Dharavi bandwagon and produced his own very popular 4-part television series. So the spectacularization of the urban is not simply high-rise skylines, it's not simply fabulous entertainment districts, it also includes a very important part of the urbanization story. Now obviously we're shifting to the rural. The simple point of this and the next 3 slides is to demonstrate, if you like, the evacuation of the rural, the spectralization of the rural, and in that evacuation there becomes a condition whereby the rural becomes a standing reserve or a resource which is simply there to feed and to support the growing urban population. And I'll come back to these images in a little bit more detail, but keep in mind some of the kind of main things: the emptiness of the image, the monocultural, literal monoculturing of this landscape. Try and imagine how many people are in the slide, and try and think about the relationship between the dwelling, which you can see in the top of the slide, and the amount of hinterland related to that individual dwelling. And this is wheat. This is corn in southern Ohio. Similar kind of a relationship. Try and think of the number of people. We don't know where the dwelling would be, but presumably there is a kind of center somewhere to this farm. So this is corn, and this is rice. This is probably the most deceptive image, and I'll come back and linger on this in much greater detail in a moment. partly because we can only see one person in this image, but it's a very deceptive image. Now, it may be a shock. It certainly was a shock to me when I first came across this statistic. The world has over 50,000 edible plants. Just 3 of them, rice, maize, and wheat, provide 60% of the world's food energy intake. So it's very significant that we're thinking through the question of the rural and agriculture in particular. So now to kind of develop a little bit more some of the consequences of this kind of evacuation or the hollowing out of the industrialization even of the countryside agriculture. By my calculation, there are maybe 4 people in this slide, 4 people operating. Occasionally, when a truck comes alongside, a further person has to be added. But this is fundamentally a mechanized landscape. It's a vast terrain which is organized according to a prosthetic relationship between individuals and machinery. I don't want to make this too crude a distinction between the spectacle of the city and the spectre of the countryside. The countryside is represented, as you can see from these images. It also has a kind of spectacle quality, but it's a much diminished one. So I hunted and hunted to find a film about wheat growing, and I found this from 1987. It's a B-grade, maybe C-grade film. It's called Race Against the Harvest, and it's as it says here, it's a story of Walter Duggan and his battle with the landscape and the harvest. I'm simply kind of drawing this attention to this because the landscape is also spectacularized. It has a visual and virtual dimension. But it's important to think about the ways in which this film develops the drama. And as you can see from the cover of the video, the drama is all about the landscape, the man, and the machine. So it demonstrates again the profound mechanization of the landscape. So trucks, combine harvesters, guns, Stetsons, you get the picture. Now, interesting thing, we could have probably have done the same thing with corn, but I couldn't find any film, dramatic account about set in cornfields. However, it is quite famous that the Amish community, for example, are closely involved in the production of corn. And this is a very useful kind of example to remind us, in a way, of a kind of pre-mechanized landscape. So if we think about the mechanical landscape in the main image and the inset, we see 3 different conditions of corn. This is corn ripened, this has been cut, and then this is corn being bundled. And the relationship between the cornfield and the domestic environment is also very important and contrasting. This is not an authentic image, this is in a way a touristic image, so it also is in a way a spectacularization of the countryside. So to come to rice, which is really the central kind of point and central terrain that I really want to investigate. This is a deceptive image for reasons that I will elaborate in a second. So it's deceptive, first of all, because rice agriculture tends to be labor heavy. Many people are required to work and to harvest rice. Furthermore, most of the people who do that work are women. And furthermore to that, most of the land holdings are very, very small by comparison to the wheat fields and the corn that we've seen. So a typical land holding would be 1 to 1.5 hectares, for example. And that means that we get a very diverse, a much more diverse landscape, because in fertile areas, rice agriculture, there can be 3 harvests per year. So in one visual sweep, if you like, we can have rice being planted, as you can see in the lower image, or rice being harvested in the top image, and there are other images where I can show where there are different kind of conditions. Again, it's not to say that rice is simply does not have mechanized supports, but mechanization and rice just has not gone together very well. And to this day, the bulk of rice production is primarily manual and primarily labor intensive. So this is, as you saw from the buffalo, that's it. And again, this is a much more typical kind of image of rice, where we have rice which is available now for harvesting, rice which has just been harvested, and fallow grounds which have been prepared for the next plantation. Again, it's not to say that rice is not represented. It's a very important site of representation. So this is the point where the spectacle and the spectre kind of intersect again. Again, we know many of these kinds of images. This is a very famous kind of genre from 1961 in China. The collectivization, the collective kind of production on the land. But again, keep in mind bear in mind how different this is to the figure of the wheat and Walter Duggan, for example, and his machines. It's a different hat for a start, different gender. But also in the background, you can see that this is an insistently collective form of agriculture. And it's profoundly different to the corn and the wheat that we've seen. So to line the three up, remember this is like in snapshot, 60% of the world's food intake is represented by one or other of these forms of agriculture. I began by saying that there is primarily a spectralization of the urban. That's not quite true, because each of them has its own very thin visual culture that goes with it. But each of those is also very telling. So a collective, a gendered female form of production, labor-intensive, masculine, mechanical, and typically with less numbers of people than you can see on this video cover. And a kind of interesting anomaly in the middle. I find that quite an anomalous traditional form of production. Okay, to become a little bit more technical about it, let's start with the image on the far left. This is an account about the world's labor. So, industry, agriculture, services, unemployed. And the big green dots here, these kind of main centers of agricultural production, are lined up with China and Indonesia. So these are the only ones that appear on this significantly on this chart. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is this is the rate of production of each of those three grains. Now, if you look at the kind of that growth in production, this is primarily through labor efficiency, but also after the Green Revolution, it was also in the greater efficiency of the seed, the greater yield itself in the seed. Now, I want you to try and keep this image in mind. And this is an image, again, I'm sure many of you know, this is a very famous population chart from the United Nations. This is, as they say, in lesser developed regions, these two lines, and this is primarily North America and Europe and Australia. This is the rural population dipping, and this is the urban population increasing. So the people who are growing and making the food are reducing, the people consuming the foods are increasing, and you can see it's not very complicated to understand that at some point the increasing demands on efficiency, labor production, and the efficiency of the yield will have a very striking consequences on the way in which cities urbanize. So I hope that gives you a feeling for this idea that the spectacularization of the city is interesting, valuable, and relevant, but it's also, I think, rather deceptive. And the spectralization of the rural is a real dilemma, and it's an important dilemma that we have to think about collectively. What I'd like to now do is become a little bit more territorial about this story and take us into thinking through some of the sites of production, in particular of rice. Okay, I'm going to flick through these, but you just get a feeling of this is the distribution of wheat in the world. Probably, I think most of us would recognize that. Australia, the Midwest of America, a lot. Europe, maize, which coincides pretty closely, and then finally rice. Now, it's no accident that rice is grown precisely in the area where we know from all the United Nations statistics show that the future cities will be located. So the question of rice and the question of urbanization between now and the end of the century, I believe, are profoundly linked. And they have to be linked, which means we have to have a better understanding of how rice is produced. We have to have a better understanding about the territory in which rice is produced, because these sustain the largest populations in the world. Again, we can see this image that Christian, I think, has already shown. So through the North India belt, China, and then Java standing out in a way as the three triangles around the place where we all of us in FCL work in Singapore. So we think it's profoundly relevant that in Singapore we're thinking through the issues that Lai Chu was talking about, as well as these wider kind of questions for this in this regional terrain. Also keep in mind that the patches of red, if you like, which are represented in Europe and America, are much more city-like. They look like they can be bounded populations, whereas in most of the area that we're looking at, this is a kind of unbounded kind of settlement. Is it city? Is it countryside? We're not quite sure. This is a real test of nerves, isn't it? When I'm okay, this is a similar drawing, similar kind of intensities on the map. But this is a very, very helpful from the World Resources Institute. This is a world map according to watersheds. So each of the outlines that you see is a river and its catchment. So what I'm going to do is take you into the Southeast Asian region for the reasons that I've just described. Okay. So, slightly different graphic, but the same kind of idea. So the Salween River, the Irrawaddy River coming down through Rangoon. The Cisadane River is the one in Jakarta that I'll come and speak to in greater detail in a second. Kapuas River is really a forest river, which is an interesting kind of case, which I'll describe. Probably better known, the Mekong River, right all the way up from the Himalayas, right down through to Ho Chi Minh City. The Chao Phraya River is watershed, and its delta in Bangkok, which flooded to great effect recently. The Red River coming out at Hanoi, and then the Yangtze River, of course, in Shanghai. The Murray-Darling is also interesting as a comparator case. So each of those rivers will have one slide, and this is the kind of format by which each of those slides will be set out. And I just want to blow up these two kind of legends to give you a feeling. So this is the Mekong watershed. The main things to keep in mind is in the colours of this image are the cropland, which is this orange colour, which we can assume primarily will be rice. And then the second image colour to keep in mind is the red, which is the urban. So this is the kind of primary sort of lens to keep in mind. In these other images, which primarily map the average population density across the watershed, the darker the colour, the higher the density. And keep in mind that these are people per square kilometre. And it's slightly different from the terminology that Lai Chu was using. But 500 people per square kilometre, that's a kind of American suburban town. That gives you kind of feeling for the kind of density. This is not downtown Singapore or Mumbai by any means, but it's certainly quite a heavily populated kind of terrain. Okay, the Mekong watershed, as you see, it's one of the most complex transnational watersheds. It comes out at Ho Chi Minh City. The first thing to keep in mind here is that it supports across the whole of this watershed 71 people per square kilometre, and there's about 800,000 square kilometres in that watershed. This is a comparative set of slides, so I hope it becomes clearer as we go along. So most of that orange will be rice. Most of the urban settlements are located as these smaller kind of settlements. This is a kind of Google Earth snapshot taken from down here somewhere. And it gives you a feeling of what that 71 persons per square kilometre looks like. So not really urban, not really rural either. It's a kind of linear village morphology. The Chao Phraya watershed in Bangkok, terminating here in Bangkok, supports 120 people per square kilometre. And again, the morphology you'll recognise. This is taken from quite near Bangkok, so you can see the emergence of gated communities and golf courses alongside a vernacular rice form of settlement. But again, look at the diversity, the spread of the rice in the orange, and look at the relationship between the red and the orange, the settlement, all through this very, very expansive terrain, 178,000 square kilometers. Here we're looking at Hanoi in the Red River. Again, I'm just going to go a bit quicker through here, so 190, so slightly higher density. Again, the density goes directly hand in hand with the rice agriculture. It's exactly what the theory proves. This is the Yangtze watershed. Now we're up to over 1.5 million square kilometers, so really a vast and very, very significant system supporting across the whole of that 1.7 million square kilometers, 200 people per hectare, per square kilometer. And again, you get a feeling for the morphology of the way in which that's distributed. Keep in mind the corn, keep in mind the monoculture of the wheat fields. Kapuas, by comparison, only 20 per square kilometer, and very little rice field. This is primarily green, so this is a kind of a settlement which is emerging from old growth forest. This is kind of rainforest. So this is quite a different kind of story, but useful, I think, to keep in mind as a contrast to the rice. I'm sure I pressed it. Yes. And then, by comparison to the Mississippi watershed, the largest of the ones that I'm presenting, probably no surprise to you, 21 people per square kilometer. This is precisely where the story of Walter Duggan was played out. This is the story of the monocultural wheat and maize and corn crops. And again, look at the relationship between, we know that this orange now is not rice, this is wheat, corn, and also look at the urban centres. It falls into a much more conventional and, to I think our eyes, a recognisable pattern. So bounded cities with a countryside beyond the edge of the city. And finally, by comparison, we can go to Australia, the Murray-Darling. This is a whole system which is in crisis because it's being used so heavily. But if we look at the kind of figure here, simply 2 people per square kilometre for the whole of this kind of system. So again, if we look at the top image, this is a much more American kind of typology. Okay, now let's move into Southeast Asia, and I'm going to specifically talk about Jakarta. The conditions that we find, as we've seen from those watershed stories, is replicated across a whole range of territories. The area that I'm going to look at is at this end of Java, Jakarta city itself, and then the smaller kind of satellite cities, and we're going to look in a zone here, which is somewhere between an urban and a rural condition, marked by these transect zones. Calcutta, Tianjin area, and Jakarta. Each of these shows conditions which are urban, suburban, quasi-urban, rural, all at the same time. And I think this is a very important kind of condition that we need to be thinking about in this story of urbanization in the coming years. This is the transect for Jakarta. On the edge of Jakarta, you can see that from 1928 to 2005, these orange areas represent industrial estates. The red areas represent gated communities. So there's a hardening of the landscape, there's a thickening of the landscape through that period. We've done a lot of kind of research, which is qualitative research, interviewing people on the ground. These are farmers and bureaucrats and farmers who've now become entrepreneurs and failed entrepreneurs who've gone back to farming. So it's a very dynamic social condition. And that dynamic social condition is also represented, if you like, in the changing fabric of this peri-urban part of Jakarta, which I can speak about on another occasion, perhaps. And then finally, to come to the question of housing, and this is the propositional part in a way. As I said earlier, I'm interested in research and how we arrive, the analytical questions behind, but also we were interested also in applications and in thinking propositionally about this. To do that, we are working in an island called Batam, which is located here, and it's just simply pragmatic and convenient. It's the nearest part of Indonesia to where we work, so it means that we can test bed, if you like, and develop some of the housing typologies that we hope will later be applied in precisely these peri-urban areas that I've been discussing, these rice hinterland areas. So a number of housing models are already available in the area. Big industrial estates, car assembly plants, Nike shoe assembly plants, and so on, have dormitories like this. In fact, this is from Batam, but this is a very typical kind of housing form. The government has sub-HDB or Singaporean Housing Development Board projects, like these are walk-up flats. Again, quite expensive, quite difficult to occupy over time for a family, but this is a Indonesia-wide program. And then much more typically are examples like this, again from Batam, but typical all across large cities of Indonesia. And these are self-made houses, often of very bad quality, but in prime locations. So there's a real urbanistic logic to the site selection for most of these communities. And then the Batam government have been also very adept in developing a site and services program, which attempts to take the most well-established of those informal communities, squatter communities, and then give them sites and basic services. The emerging middle class is also very well represented. They have incredible aspirational kind of qualities, and there's a very important kind of taste culture, if you like, which we have to kind of keep in mind as well. So this is not kind of trying to iron out in some kind of standardized form of housing. This is an especially spectacular version, as is this. So keep in mind, these are examples from Batam, but they're relatively well represented across Indonesia, and it's an environment that we were trying to connect with. Slightly more formally, we can do density analyses of each of these. We can also show that the first two examples, Rusun and KSB, tend to be monofunctional. In other words, they're shelter and nothing more. Probably the best example, although it's the most decrepit piece of infrastructure, in fact, is the informal settlement. Because the informal settlement allows vestiges of agriculture. It allows chickens, it allows horticulture, it produces shelter, and also is a very, very flexible economic support platform. So we're very interested in this model, but we don't want to romanticize about it. It has serious issues in terms of health, hygiene, flooding, vulnerability, etc. So our proposal is to think through the logic of the squatter housing, and many of you who work in this field will know the term incremental housing. And the incremental housing is simply to loosen up the fabric of the architecture itself. So if we take a moment to unpack this image, this is time across the bottom axis. The blue line is the size of the family, so it grows and contracts. There's a dotted line above. These are extended family members who come and join. So although the nuclear family reduces in size as the children move away, others kind of join. The number of rooms increases, as does the income. Now, it's the yellow line which is interesting to us, because this is the fabric of the building itself, changing in relationship to the family makeup and in relationship to the economy of the family as well. And this flexibility is profoundly important. It's been theorized at great length in architecture, and it's been practiced all over the world by squatter communities. The most important of these theoretical, the most succinct, if you like, of these theoretical accounts comes from John Turner in the 1960s and 70s. And if you, planning, constructing, and managing are the main titles across the top. State, private, and community along the vertical axis. This probably is an image of the Singaporean HDB. In other words, heavily planned, constructed, and managed. The state is heavily involved in those activities. And this is probably one of the best examples worldwide, as we know, of a very centrally organized state-supported housing system. So a very successful model. It's not a model that can be replicated in too many other places in the world. And the image on the far left is the one which is typically, this is the kind of self-made image. So while the state may have some role in planning, They have a diminished role in construction and a very small role in management. All of that is then taken up primarily by the community or even the kind of the local community, the family itself, and the private sector is often involved in the construction process. Now, there's a very interesting history. This is one of the oldest of such projects. This is the first occasion that architects were formally involved in an incremental housing project. So a very interesting moment in the history of the architectural discipline. This is in Peru and Lima, where South America urbanized earlier than Africa and Asia. So it's no accident that we find this project developing at an earlier stage. This involves 20-something architects from all around the world thinking through this question of incremental growth. The image on the top is one of the only examples that we can find of formal architectural involvement in the incremental housing project. This is a UN Habitat competition from 1976, and New Zealand architect Ian Affield was the winner. The project itself, in fact, is not incremental, although it's tuned into the tropical environment in particular. So very nice things about both examples, but neither of which are a neat fit, if you like, for the circumstances and the rice hinterlands that I've been discussing. One of the things about the rice, a vernacular that attaches to rice agriculture, in fact, is a kind of mobile architecture. So these are kind of mobile forms of settlement. In each case, we can see rice in the background. So we're interested in the lightness of this. We're interested in the mobility of this. We also have a sort of non-local vernacular example, a very beautiful example here from the Netherlands. And in each case, we're interested in the roof and the way in which the roof itself might be mobile in the growth and the expansion of the fabric of this incremental house. So the incrementality, if you like, happens in our project through the roof, and we do that through these examples. So this is where we are. This is the least developed aspect of the project, as you can see, but we can get the idea of a foundation. Probably the image on the top left captures it best. We want a solid foundation. We want a lightweight roof that comes and goes depending on the fabric, the economy, and the makeup of the family in the meantime. The roof also is an energy unit, so it develops solar energy. It catches water, harvests water. So these are all potentially could be localized energy units and highly autonomous form of infrastructure. So relatively crude, but you can see the direction here. The urban level is probably slightly better developed. In this case, you probably recognize one of these outlines. So this is a single unit with a shared stairway, a garden attached, a nice kind of hierarchy of social and public spaces with a bamboo nursery attached. In theory, the bamboo produced after 5 years would provide the fabric for the extension of all of these houses over time. So there's another dimension of autonomy in this example. This is a 1 hectare image, and I'll tell you why in a second. If we multiply that by 16 hectares and we add the required, by Indonesian law, we add the additional kind of features, we come to something that we call a tropical town for 6,000 residents. Now keep in mind that the fabric of this town, in a way, is breathing over time. And this is what allows it, I think, to be engaged and sensitive to the rice agricultural terrain. Probably the crudest of all of the images we produced so far, but it's important to us because it locates it back in that environment. We have rice agricultural conditions, we have heavy industry on the far left, but we also have horticultural and other forms, a diversified, this is an image, if we like, of a diversified economic terrain. So to do a quick comparison, if the pointer will allow me. Okay, so here's some kind of basic comparisons. We don't meet the same density of the state-provided monocultural monster, I would like to say, but we think with the additional amenity we can approach this, and this becomes a far more responsible form of housing. And the most important drawing of all, this is an imagined scenario, if you like, of the growth and contraction that's possible with this. So these are commercial functions which can emerge inside the fabric of this when the family raising, if you like, has been completed or is at a lull. I wonder, would you mind just fast forwarding about, just every 1 second. This is the bamboo in year 1. We would regard these as state infrastructure. This is the state intervention at the beginning, and all the coloured things that you see will be community built and community led. Keep going. A bamboo workshop for the development of skills of bamboo. The bamboo is now in its 5th year, so it's ready to be harvested and is starting now to be contributing to the material fabric of this 1 hectare fantasy community. Some people are starting to build on 2nd and 3rd stories. Some are communities, localized, more intimate communities are developing very well. Some are contracting in order to grow again. Some of the garden spaces that you can see here have been built upon. A community centre in the middle, we hope, is doing its work, is parliamentary representational work. We can keep going through here, and we get I hope the idea of these slides is to give you a feeling of this kind of vertical kind of breathing of this fabric over the time. There is some lateral kind of breathing as well. Quick comparison, for those of you who know Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, population 3,000, this is our tropical town, 6,000. Next image. Next. Another very famous example, Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, 32,000. Our tropical town, 3,000. Or you can get a feeling for how that might compare. Probably the most important thing that I would borrow from Ebenezer Howard is this little warning: NB, diagram only, plan cannot be drawn until site selected. And we're discussing with the government in Batam right now. Final image. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. We are running out of time, but maybe I allow one question, one final question. Who would like to take the opportunity? Yes, okay. Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much for this array of slides. So, but can you help me to, what is the central message you want me to take home?
Well, we'd like a site to build our prototype. That's the kind of key message, I guess. But more academically, I want to draw attention to the fact that the rural is super important for the production of cities, if only for the relationship between food production. Secondly, there are different kinds of rural, and they have radically different consequences depending on where we are in the world. Thirdly, rice agriculture is probably the most important issue for the urbanization of India, China, and Southeast Asia. Not only because of food, but because the rice agricultural landscape supports very high densities of people. And these people who are currently farmers on their 1 acre, 1.5 hectare plots are going to be urbanizing in situ. So what happens to the landscape? What happens to the distribution? How do we support infrastructure, and so on and so on? And I come back to the point that this project is an attempt to engage architecturally and urbanistically with that dilemma. So there's a very big, broad set of insights that I would like to deliver and work upon, and then a set of much more acupunctural responses, if you like. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Great. So.